drugs as a security problem in the past couple of years with Virginia Comely, who's Skyping in from San Francisco actually at the moment, and Nigel Inkster, who's our Director of Transnational Threats. Today we have with us David Yulee-Taylor, Professor of International Relations and Public Policy and Director of the Global Drug Policy Observatory within the College of Arts and Humanities at Swansea University. That's a long sentence. He gained his PhD from the University of Wales in 1996, was appointed as a lecturer at Swansea University in 2000, and has been a visiting lecturer at a number of universities in the U.S. He's an IDPC associate, where he directs the Modernizing Drug Law Enforcement Project. He's an associate fellow at the Transnational Institute and was the founding secretary of the International Society for the Study of Drug Policy. We also have with us Vanda Velbed-Brown, a senior fellow for the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. She's an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats, including insurgency, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. Her fieldwork and research have covered, among other things, Afghanistan, South Asia, Burma, Indonesia, and the Andean region, Mexico, Morocco, Somalia, and Eastern Africa. So all over. And finally, Virginia Comely, Research Associate for Transnational Threats at the IISS in London, though she's in San Francisco today. In her current capacity, she has responsibility for covering extremism, transnational organized crime, and security threats in West Africa and the Sahel. Previous experience includes secondment to the British Ministry of Justice and work for a private security company and a strategic intelligence firm. She's the co-author with Nigel Inkster of Drugs, Insecurity, and Failed States, The Problems of Prohibition, which you can buy at the front desk, and I recommend you all do that. And she's author of a forthcoming book on Boko Haram's insurgency in Nigeria. We're going to start with David, go to Vanda, and then Virginia will close it out. So we'll try to be about 30 minutes of discussion, and then 20, 25, maybe 30 minutes for Q&A. So over to David.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, Randy. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here today. My role here is really quite straightforward. I'm just going to provide an overview of the Modernizing Drug Law Enforcement Project, introduce some of the key underpinning concepts and objectives before I then hand over to Vanda and Virginia to unpack some of the specific aspects of this increasingly important aspect of public policy. So just to reiterate a little about the project, the Modernising Drug Law Enforcement Project itself is an initiative of IDPC, that's the International Drug Policy Consultant, and it operates in partnership with the International Security Research Department at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Chatham House, and the IISS. And these organisations came together last year in response to significant changes in the way that both researchers and in some instances police services were viewing alternative approaches to dealing with the illicit drug market. I think it's important to stress when we're talking about contextualising the project that for decades, for many, many years, drug law enforcement has been focused on the ultimate goal of reducing the size of or eliminating the illicit drug market, or at least stifling drug production, stifling distribution to an extent that potential consumers are unable to get access to particular drugs. So with that in mind, strategies and tactics of law enforcement agencies have consequently been designed to maximise the destruction of drug crops, the seizure of drugs, disrupt trafficking and dealing groups, and through the threat and application of arrest and punishment, also to deter current and potential drug users. So this approach has been applied across the continuum of the illicit market. But it's become also increasingly clear in recent years that these strategies have been unable to significantly or permanently reduce the supply of or the demand for the main drugs of choice in consumer markets. So we have to acknowledge that there has been some geographic or temporally specific examples of what we might define as success for law enforcement interventions. Although here we have to introduce a number of caveats. It's sometimes very difficult to attribute the change in the market to particular factors, and also in many instances, as I think Vanda will talk about, the illicit activity is simply displaced elsewhere. So given this reality and a wider policy context where some authorities are moving away, in some cases, particularly in the United States, significantly away from what we might call punitive prohibition or the war on drugs approach, and more towards market management, drug law enforcement strategies clearly need to be adjusted to fit this new and shifting landscape. So that's to say there's a challenge, therefore, to manage drug markets in a way that minimises the range of harmful impacts on communities, including in relation to corruption and financial crimes such as money laundering. But the idea of minimising harm is particularly the case where drug-related violence is concerned. Now, evidence suggests that this is associated with a complex mix of socio-economic factors. And although difficult to define, violence in the form of threats, assaults, sexual violations and other forms of interpersonal conflict, as well as murder, is not an inevitable aspect of the illicit market. The type and levels of drug market violence depend largely on the nature of the drug market itself, and this is often shaped by the law enforcement response to it. Indeed, research has shown that the action of governing authorities can be a major contributor to or cause of systemic violence in production, transit and retail markets. A recognition that law enforcement powers can be used to constructively or even beneficially shape rather than eradicate any given drug market is being increasingly discussed in academic and research communities and is present in many internal strategy discussions. Also has to be noted that it's been implemented as an explicit strategy in a few instances, but that said, it's not been widely analysed and debated across the law enforcement field. Now, while this is the case, I think it's possible to identify a number of interrelated concepts that underpin such a change in thinking. And first among these is the need to change objectives and indicators. So in a nutshell, this really involves moving away from simplistic and often problematic metrics concerned with numbers of drugs arrests, numbers of seizures and quantities of drugs seized, and hectares of drug crops eradicated and even assets confiscated, towards indicators of community health and community well-being. Things like reductions in market-related violence and corruption, improvements in public health and economic development, and the strengthening of community institutions. Now, I think this is crucial, and we found this within the project itself, because a combination of law enforcement performance targets, so effectively KPIs, and these simple metrics can create a vicious circle that is difficult to break. Now, this isn't going to be easy, and the longevity of and preference for the current indicators reflect the current challenges of data capture. But there's a beginning appreciation of a need to shift to metrics that measure outcomes that really do matter. Now, the second concept underpinning a change in thinking is a focus on gathering intelligence and analysis on the nature of the drug market and the problems it causes to the law-abiding community. So when more is known about these factors, law enforcement actions can then be specifically designed to reduce the identified problems. So that would be what we can call a harm reduction approach to law enforcement. But in this way, law enforcement actions, resources and tactics are carefully targeted on aspects of production, trafficking and drug dealing where the most impact on the identified harms can be achieved. And meanwhile, relatively harmless forms of the market can be tolerated. And in some cases, this takes on the form of targeted deterrence, where the tactic is actually openly publicised in an attempt to encourage traffickers or dealers to self-regulate their behaviour towards less harmful activities. And the final concept that I want to mention is a careful concentration of enforcement action on the basis of the levels and types of harm caused by those individuals or groups engaged in various ways in the illicit market, rather than a simplistic focus on those that are the easiest to catch. So this involves removing the discrimination and injustice often caused by the application of tough penalties to what we might call the little fish within the market. Now, as you're probably aware, none of these concepts are entirely new, but arguably they have yet to be widely understood by law enforcement leaders or embedded into drug law enforcement strategies. And so with all this in mind, the Modernising Drug Law Enforcement project has two core objectives. It's to collate and refine theoretical material and practical examples of these approaches, but also to promote and sustain debate amongst law enforcement leaders and institutions on the implications for future strategies. So far the project has involved three reinforcing work streams, and I would call this phase one of the initiative. We have put together a publication series. Now this comprises of 6 reports that are targeted at senior members of the law enforcement community and policymakers. Now these, in the main, are synthetic, that's to say they don't involve any or a great deal of original research, more they hoover up what we've already learnt from the academic and research community and put them together in what I hope is an academically robust yet accessible way that explores the theoretical concepts underpinning these shifts in drug law enforcement approaches and examines specific examples of its implementation. So, how am I doing for time? Okay, so I'll just quickly run through some of the titles. We've looked at police support for harm reduction policies and practices towards people who inject drugs. So it's very much police and health-oriented approaches to the drug market. Focused deterrence, selective targeting, drug trafficking and organised crime, which a report that my colleague Vanda authored, and she'll be talking to some of the key points within that report shortly. Applying harm reduction principles to the policing of retail drug markets. So as I said, we're not just talking about the supply side, we're also looking at our retail markets as well. Practical implications of policing alternatives to arrest and prosecution for minor cannabis offences. Within this report, what we were looking at really was how do law enforcement agencies deal with policy shifts? What are the practical implications for guys actually on the beat and trying to enforce these new laws? We looked at drug law enforcement and financial investigation strategies, and our final report looked at drug market security and foreign aid, and this is the issue that Virginia will speak to shortly. Obviously conscious of the time and the fact that I've already been talking far too long, so I won't bore you with all the exciting details of the conclusions at this point in time. However, what I would urge you to do is go to the IDPC website, where all the reports are available and easily downloadable in a PDF form. I think it's worth highlighting here, though, a number of commonalities that we saw across all the reports. Firstly, there's the importance of the perceived legitimacy of police activity within communities and nation states. That was a clearly important theme running across all of the reports. There was also the importance of targeted and cost-effective spending within an austerity environment. And then somewhat at odds with that, there was the need for more research. Now, why do I say somewhat at odds? Obviously, research costs money, but there was a clear conclusion amongst the authors that we need to learn more about how the markets operate. How do they react to specific law enforcement interventions? Effectively, what we're asking here is what law enforcement actions work and what don't, and this does need investment. Reinforcing the policy reports, the project has also attempted to develop a network through which to distribute reports to a wide audience of law enforcement leaders and policymakers, both in the UK and internationally. And then to that end, we've run a series of seminars, a couple in London, one hosted by Chatham House, one hosted by IISS. And these brought together senior members of the law enforcement community, policymakers, international civil servants, and experts from various parts of the world. And these came together to discuss the contents of the publication series and the implication for future strategies. And again, the reports from these seminars are available on the website. The project also, in order to raise its international profile, ran a satellite event at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is the key policy-making body for the United Nations system on the drugs issue in Vienna. which was interesting in terms of introducing the ideas to a broader audience and also receiving different views of the issue from different parts of the world. And yesterday in New York at the United Nations headquarters, we held a similar event, again talking about many of these issues. So, just to conclude then, where are we now? Well, it's my hope that, much like the events that I've just mentioned, today will not only help sustain the project's momentum and generate interest and debate with a different audience again, but also to help define ideas about what we might regard as phase 2 of the project. Where do we take it now? Having provided what we hope is a solid overview and an entry point even to the issue area, IDPC, Chatham House and IISS are considering the next phase of the project. So at the moment we're wondering whether or not to focus on a specific theme, one of the report topics, and unpack that and drill down further and explore the issues more thoroughly, or whether to focus on a specific region or country. Latin America would obviously be an interesting example there. Now, I think this is an interesting and fruitful discussion in and of itself, but also it takes on more significance in the light of a number of forthcoming moments to review drug policy in general. And here, really, I'm talking about Vienna and the United Nations again. There's a high-level segment of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs next year. And then in 2016, there's UNGAS, the United Nations General Assembly's special session on drugs. And this is where the international community come together to discuss their response to drug control. And as I'm sure everyone in the world, or even in the room, should I say, is aware, there's a process beginning to review how drug policy is approached, and we're hoping that the enforcement project can be part of that discussion. So, with that, thank you.
Turn it over to Amanda. I'm going to try to get Virginia online while we're doing this.
Good afternoon. We are meeting here today at a fascinating time in the evolution of the global counter-narcotics regime. On the one hand, the drug trade is arguably becoming truly global and far more diversified than it has been at any point in the modern history of the drug trade anyway. There are new suppliers, intriguing suppliers. Indonesia, for example, is a supplier of methamphetamines, an emerging market. There are new consumers. Brazil's and Argentina's consumption is probably on par with the United States and potentially going to surpass the US per capita market anyway. And there are, of course, new transshipment areas, not just West Africa that has received a lot of attention over the past several years, but Middle East increasingly, both as a consumer market, emerging consumer market, and transshipment area, but also East Africa will come in the spotlight in a far more robust way in a few years. I would make a prediction. Yet as the trade is becoming far more diversified and truly global, and the old notions of distinctions between demand countries, supplier countries, and transshipment countries are perhaps breaking down, with many of the demand countries becoming supplier countries and vice versa, many of the traditional supplying countries becoming very robust demand markets. International drug policy is increasingly showing a great deal of dissension. And indeed, there is an emerging global dissensus, if you would indulge the term, as to how the global drug trade should be managed. And perhaps we are standing on the cusp of even the end of the counter-narcotics regime as it was orchestrated, managed, policed by the United States over the past several decades, with Latin America in particularly increasingly chafing at policies that used to be promoted by the United States, eradication, interdiction, and not just chafing, but offering alternative approaches. And yet some other important countries, such as China and Russia, demanding not just the same old policies, but at a level of intensity that arguably even surpasses the US at its most committed doctrinaire era of the late 1980s and early 1990s. And particularly as there is this fundamental challenge to the global counter-narcotics regime because of a lot of evidence that many of the traditional policies have not only been ineffective, but often have been deeply counterproductive with a whole range of secondary but important objectives, and sometimes even with the very primary objective that the goals, that were the identified goals. It's important to focus on some of the broad lessons that we can take away. And I'll talk predominantly about, I would say, that the most wicked problem of the drug trade, and that's the violence associated with it, and speak about focused deterrence strategies and selective targeting that were in the report that Dave mentioned. But let me make several broader points beyond that elaboration. I think the one important lesson is, and I would start with that lesson and then contradict everything else in the rest of the talk, is that one of the major reasons why the global counter-narcotics regime has run into so much problem is that it tries to apply the same policy to very many different settings, irrespective of different contexts. And even many of the drug policy reformers are, in fact, falling into that same problem of trying to apply one prescription, one policy, even if a radically different one, to a set of different problems. Yet context matters. One shoe does not fit all. Policies need to be tailored to different cultural and institutional contexts. At the same time, why this is so difficult with respect to the drug trade is because it is a transnational phenomenon, and so policies in one country inevitably have spillover effects for other countries. Hence, there is this drive toward unity, yet then applying same policies often leads to very problematic outcomes. Now, with that big caveat that specificity is key to design of good policy, let me then draw some big lessons. The one is that we cannot eradicate our way out of the drug use. I think that the US has increasingly come to understand this, but new countries such as China and Russia continue to be very much wedded to the notion that if only one eradicates illicit crops enough, this will have radical effects on drug use. Second lesson, we cannot arrest our way out of drug use. Simply throwing users and even low-level pushers and non-violent dealers into prisons only makes things worse. People continue to use in prison. They often end up even further addicted. Their social options afterwards radically change. These policies are ineffective. They violate human rights. They compound whole manner of criminality, and they are very expensive. The third lesson is in some ways most controversial and really difficult, and that is that we cannot coordinate our way out of the drug policy. It goes back to what I was saying, that one shoe fits all approaches. The desire for harmony and unity runs into the real contradiction or the reality that different countries have different capacities for implementing policy, and inevitably balloon effects take place. They will take place irrespective of what policies are adopted. Even if there is legalization, balloon effects of one sort or another will ensue. And it is especially the balloon effects, the fact that if eradication is successful in the country, if interdiction is successful in a particular region, the trade shifts to other areas, that often generates the greatest trauma, security threats, and human security threats for states and countries. Yet it's almost the wicked problem out of which there is really no way to coordinate its way out. And then makes real difficulties in using eradication or interdiction as a mechanism to essentially allocate where the global bad or even turned into global good will take place, because obviously different countries will have radically different notions as to whether they should be the locus of the drug trade, production, trafficking, or not. As Dave mentioned, the preoccupation has been with suppressing flows, often to the detriment of ignoring other highly negative effects of the drug trade, including primary security threats. And the notion was that only flows are suppressed sufficiently, other threats, including use, will be mitigated. That has by and large not taken place. And instead, what we should focus in the case of the drug trade, one which is in an undepletable resource, where production and trafficking trade will move somewhere as long as there is demand, and there will be demand, is then suppressing the severe harms and threats to states that can be associated with it, namely violence. Now, you can say that violence is inevitable if it's linked to the drug trade. If the drug trade is illegal, there will be violence. Not so. There is a great diversity in how criminal markets, including drug markets, are violent and how much capacity for corruption they have. The US drug market today here in Washington, D.C. is very peaceful and looks dramatically different than the very violent Washington, D.C. drug market in the 1980s. The Asian drug trade in Southeast Asia, robust as it is, on par with Latin America's in terms of the amount of flows, is peaceful by a degree of magnitude compared to how violent the drug market and other criminal markets in Latin America are. Similarly, legal economies can be very peaceful, or they can be very violent and pervaded by a lot of corruption, negative social effects. Think, for example, of the trade in wildlife or trade in timbers or minerals. Think Congo versus Malaysia. So the key issue then is how one manages, and I use the term manage, both illegally and legal markets. One can have them managed well, and one can have them managed badly. And one of the sort of key thrusts of the Modernizing drug law enforcement project is to stop being preoccupied predominantly with driving flows down and focus on primarily suppressing several negative aspects associated with the trade, the number one being violence. Now, there are different ways to go about it. New York, for example, claims to be very successful with implementing zero-tolerance approaches. A lot of people are challenging the notion and saying zero-tolerance approaches have come with great human rights and civil liberties harms. There are major challenges to this approach in U.S. courts right now. But irrespective of what your assessment of zero-tolerance approaches in New York is, such policies have really struggled when they have been exported abroad. There, by and large, they have failed, particularly in developing countries with poorly resourced and relatively small police forces. They simply cannot achieve the density that's required for zero-tolerance approaches, and on top of that, they come with all the negative side effects in terms of human rights violations, civil liberties violations, and essentially end up only empowering corrupt and under-resourced police forces in taking over criminal markets abroad. So zero tolerance is not a good model for developing countries, and one can question whether it is a good model in countries with strong and large police forces. An alternative, particularly in very violent markets, overwhelmed by both the amount of flows as well as the amount of violence and highly corrupt and under-resourced police forces, such as in Latin America, is then to adopt focused deterrence strategies. They, again, are modeled on policies that have been experimented and highly successful in U.S. settings. The mother of these policies was Boston Operation Ceasefire, and they have been then spread to other U.S. cities and attempted in Rio, for example. They focused deterrence strategies, of course, do not originate in the world of crime. They originate, in fact, in the world of conventional and nuclear deterrence, and argue that given certain density of bad actors, in this case criminals, one needs certain density of law enforcement forces. And if one cannot achieve this density, then one needs to focus very specifically what one seeks to deter and concentrate police forces. So the argument here is that instead of police saying there can be no drug trafficking in a city, which would require such intensity of resources that essentially no police department in the world can achieve that, the goal is to say that criminals should behave, drug traffickers should behave the way they behave in DC today, that is very non-violently, as opposed to the way they behaved in the 1980s. So the focus of law enforcement then becomes the group that is most violent. For example, the Zeta. But then the policing doesn't end there, and once the law enforcement institution becomes effective in acting against the most violent group, it starts targeting the second most violent group, etc., so that criminals do not get the carte blanche. Now, the policy is also often misunderstood as suggesting that other forms of criminality will not be punished, and that there is a sort of implicit or even explicit signal that it's okay to peddle in drugs, for example. The policies do not have to be designed that way, and in fact are problematic in my view if they say other forms of criminality are okay. It's sufficient signal to say we will go after you, you're a trafficker. We will really go after you if you are a violent drug trafficker. It's a much better signal to send. Now, these policies have been tried abroad. They have been exported from Boston to Rio, and in fact the designers of the policy in Boston were advisors of the policy in Rio in 1990s, in mid-1990s, and the policy struggled. And one of the reasons they struggled is that they encountered very corrupt law enforcement that was essentially unwilling as well as unable to deliver the precision of signaling and then to deliver on the signals. Now, UPP is another version of essentially focused deterrence, and this time along it seems to be doing better. The verdict is still out, and it's not just about focused deterrence. UPP, the current Rio policy, has other aspects to it, but context matters. I am being told to close. I want to make 2 points, especially because we have a DC audience, somewhat different than yesterday in New York, and I see many people actually involved in law enforcement. One is that high-value targeting, which has become arguably one of the most popular security policies over the past decades in many different domains, is often very problematic when applied to criminal markets, particularly drug trade, and often generates a lot of problems. And a much better way of targeting, of designing interdiction, is not high-value targeting, but middle-level targeting. I'll leave it just as a teaser, and then question and answer period can deal more with that. And the second favored US approach of building specialized interdiction units is equally problematic policy. I understand the origins, I understand how very difficult it is to build any policy in the context of highly corrupt and inadequate law enforcement partners. But nonetheless, the chance that specialized interdiction units will go rogue and will become the top traffickers on the block is very substantial. And these need to build into policy consideration and design far more robustly than we have done. We leave it at that, and that should be provocative enough to stimulate questions in the question and answer period.
Okay, we're now going to switch over to Virginia, assuming we can get her come up on the screen. We had her and lost her, then had her again and lost her again. So we'll see if our high-tech system actually works. I'm going to try one. This doesn't look like it's going. Try again. Let's see. Sorry about this. Perfect timing. Why don't we take a question while we're waiting for this to start working? Does anyone have any questions right now? We'll just take one while we get this going. Anyone in the audience want to? Right here. So your name and your affiliation?
I'm Jason Dixon. I'm with the Office of Management and Budget, just around the corner from here. And I was curious what you meant by mid-level targeting versus high-value targeting.
In the United States, of course, and at least U.S. domestic law enforcement, as opposed to, for example, a broad counterterrorism operation, often mid-level targeting and high-value targeting are connected. So by high-value targeting, we understand essentially a decapitation policy that's supposed to eliminate the top criminals, or in other cases, the top insurgents. Now, in practice, identifying what's a quote high-value target might be very difficult, and lots of the people targeted might end up being very low-value targets. But presumably, it would be the top leadership. Now, in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism settings, the strategy has sometimes been dramatically effective. Partially because the level of competence, charisma that it takes to be a terrorist insurgent leader is far higher than the level of competence and charisma it takes to be a criminal leader. Some criminal leaders can be super effective and super charismatic, but a lot of them often are quite surprisingly mediocre leaders. And the ease of replacement of supposedly top traffickers is often very, very dramatic. So it takes a matter of weeks, can be very traumatic weeks of lots of internal fighting or external fighting, but usually a very small amount of time for a new leader to take over whatever is left of the organization. Middle level targeting focuses much more on the operational brain value of the group. So this would be the people who are the major logisticians for the criminal group. These would be the people who launder the money. So the financial operational branch, as opposed to the head or the two heads. The difference then is, and in fact the way we do US law enforcement in the US or the British too, is to try to round up as much of the middle layer in one sweep as possible, both to generate evidence on the two capos and have successful court prosecution, but also because it paralyzes the ability of the group to operate to a far greater level than going simply after the capos. Now, eventually someone will emerge on the market to peddle whatever the criminal group was delivering to the market, but nonetheless, focusing on the middle layer is far more effective in reducing the operational capacity and in lessening the transition traumas in the market. The difficulty for implementing these strategies in a place like Mexico is that it requires a lot of intelligence, perhaps beyond signal intelligence, but more importantly, intelligence that is gathered over long periods of time, sometimes even years. And that means that there has to be assurance this will leak out. And in settings with highly corrupt law enforcement forces, especially who get intelligence predominantly from US signal intelligence, every single impulse is to act immediately when intelligence becomes available, because sitting on intelligence generates greater risks of leaking. And so although middle-level targeting is far more effective, often the temptation is to go for high-level targeting, which is often not just ineffective but counterproductive in stimulating much greater degrees of violence on the market that would be there otherwise.
Great, we have Virginia back. Let's hope this works. Virginia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Can you hear
great.
me?
Yes, definitely. Why don't you get started?
Okay, well, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be able to join you, although I'm not there in person, and hopefully technology won't let me down in the next 10 minutes. One of the aspects covered in our project relates to foreign aid and drug markets, and really how a disproportionate amount of aid is often set aside for law enforcement initiatives. We produced a report on this subject, which has been prompted really by the fact that the issue of foreign aid is often ignored by the growing international debate on drug policy. Indeed, the approaches adopted in many aid agreements seem to be insulated from the advances in the global debate about alternative drug policies and handled action, and remains heavily focused on law enforcement. Speaking in general terms, the way in which aid is conceived and distributed never develops in a vacuum, and is symptomatic of donors' priorities and interests, which at times have proved unrelated to what is in fact needed or desired at the receiving end. But if we look at specific, when it comes to dealing with foreign aid to countries impacted by drug production and drug trafficking, donors' preferences are greatly influenced by their own stance on counter-narcotics. For instance, countries favoring a predominantly law enforcement-oriented approach, such as the US and Russia, take their aid packages to Latin America or Afghanistan, just to use two examples, according to their own domestic priorities. And therefore, they strongly emphasize drug eradication, interdiction, and the strengthening of local law enforcement and military capabilities. These practices are usually implemented at the expenses of often development initiatives and almost always demand and broadly defined harm reduction measures. A further complication is that aid and drug policy suffer from significant levels of politicization, which have resulted in inconsistent international attitudes and policies towards drug producing and drug trafficking countries. Not to mention that such inconsistencies have also resulted in ineffective counter-narcotics. And I find this a particularly interesting issue, and I would like to illustrate through the case of Afghanistan. While some Latin American countries such as Colombia and Mexico have been pressured by the US and others into intensive and intrusive measures to enforce international drug prohibition, strongly
or have we lost her? Okay, we're going to stop this and try again. See if we can get her to just do a regular call, not a video call this time. Maybe the video is too much for the fragile internet. Sorry about this, everyone. Let's see if we can get her right now. If not, we'll go to another question very quickly. And we're going to go to a question. Let's get the microphone right here.
Hi, my name is Audrey Williams. I'm from the Stimson Center, and my question is specifically for David. And you were talking about how there's going to be some kind of brainstorming and initiative in terms of shaping phase 2 of this project. And I was wondering, you talked about deciding on a theme or maybe a region, but I was wondering what the activities might be. Is it going to be kind of more of the policy papers and seminars? Is it going to be bigger workshops or conferences? Might there be a pilot project in there? I was just wondering to get thank you very much. Whatever subject is decided on, what are the activities that are then going to kind of move forward in phase 2 or maybe even a phase 3 if that happens, which might be a bit ambitious. But thanks.
No, thank you for your question. All ideas welcome. I was quickly scribbling down as you were speaking at that point. Phase 1, as I said, has been very much a foundational phase, getting together some of the research, the data, and beginning to engage with the law enforcement community in a discourse about alternative approaches. So a key activity within phase 2 would be to develop that process. One thing that we've learnt during the course of the last year or so is, if I can just give you a snappy soundbite, is police talk to police. So we need to engage with the law enforcement community, get, if you like, champions involved who can then speak to the policing community, I think, with more authority than certainly myself, although not many of the researchers involved within the process, Vanda and Virginia included within that. So that would be a key aspect of the activities. And beyond maybe then generating some original research, not just synthetic and secondary research, do some original research on some of these issues. We're interested in developing some partnerships to engage in training, working with law enforcement communities, actually going into training colleges to attempt to engage with the culture within police services in various parts of the world. And of course, to pick up on Vanda's point, this has to be tailored according to specific regions, not just countries, but even locales within specific countries. So Virginia's back, so I will come to them, but these are the sorts of activities there. So if maybe we could have a quick word afterwards, I'd love to pick your brains on that, and indeed anyone's welcome within that conversation. Thank you.
Virginia, we thought maybe it would be better if you turn off the video and just do a regular voice call in terms of maintaining the connection. Is that something you can do? Unfortunately, we can't hear her. So the voice doesn't help. Virginia, we're going to try this one more time, and then maybe call my mobile phone, and we'll just put it next to the microphone. How about that? Virginia, I'm going to send you an email with my mobile phone number. Let's do another question while we're waiting for that. Right there in the back.
This question is for Vanda, and of course, if David wants to add. You mentioned the problem of corruption as an obstacle to the implementation of effective policies, and particularly law enforcement. Can you elaborate more on that? I'm interested in Latin America, in not only Mexico, but Honduras and Panama and Colombia. All of them have very serious corruption problems. Thank you.
And in some ways, you're asking the question because you know the answers. From a very well-known expert on security forces, police forces in Latin America. I mean, police forces often are corrupt, and arguably the most difficult institutional reform a country can undertake is police reform. It is far more difficult than conducting military reform, for example, and the level of success of both internal reforms with respect to militaries and externally assisted reforms with respect to law enforcement forces is far smaller than institutional reforms of, for example, fiscal systems or institutional reforms of militaries. And it's not surprising because the police sit domestically at the intersection of not just crime and legality, but crime and politics. And often they are the bridge and the mitigating factor that allows politics to capture crime, or vice versa, allows crime to capture political system and institutions. Latin America has broadly made some significant strides, depending on countries, in reducing police brutality and police abuse. It has been far less effective in increasing police effectiveness. One reason being continuing levels of corruption. It's not just the sole reason, but it's one important reason. And then the question is what kind of foreign assistance programs can countries design? I brought up building specialized interdiction units, and while this is a very seductive proposition, it's also often a proposition that's very difficult to maintain the reins on. Another one is to encourage domestic police accountability processes, such as citizens' boards, bringing experts on board with police forces, which often comes from times of real crime crises. Sao Paulo being an example where it was believed to be highly successful, and then the past 2 years are raising into question how successful the police reform, including the citizen police boards, were in fact. But at the core there needs to be sort of the classic age-old British understanding that the police are there to protect the people, and that's the primary function of the police, as opposed to the police being the tool of government, which is often the notion of how police is defined in West Africa. Police forces are corrupt because they're extremely politicized, and because the dominant function is to secure that the ruling entity has as much political power and as great economic rents. And unless this mentality, this fundamental institutional as well as popular conception of what the state is about changes, there are limits to how effective police reform can be. So, bottom line, without political will, without the real re-envisioning of the relationship between state and people, there will be limits to how effective police reform can be. And take a place like Karachi and what the urban policy that's being implemented right now over the past several weeks, it's just repetition of the same old policy with its minimal effects. And it will continue being so unless ISI, the intelligence services, the military, as well as Pakistan's feudal lords, reconceive of what the relationship between them and the population is about. And especially in a place like Karachi, where you have this seamless confluence and intermeshings of mafias that are comprised of organized crime groups and politicians. You can't tell the police to go reform themselves. and I chose the language specifically, and that's what you and that's the effect you end up with.
Yeah, yeah.
And just with regard to what Vanda was just speaking about, I think this also takes us back to the issue of metrics and indicators. I think if we start reviewing what we're measuring in terms of defining success, there's still a great deal of emphasis on interdictions. Now, what does that tell us? Well, that probably tells us that there's an increased level of law enforcement activity rather than tells us a great deal about the state of the market. We're looking at drug arrests, we're looking at the number of hectares destroyed in any drug-producing country. We've got to start moving away from those, and I think maybe indicators and metrics that look at levels of corruption within certain communities, certain authorities is also a challenge, but a challenge certainly worth engaging with.
If I can just add one more positive note to my comments, and that is actually the United States. I would argue that one of the most impressive and greatest reforms in the United States in the 20th century, on par with the civil liberties movement, was police reform that the US went through. Perhaps there are lessons from how police reform was done in the United States that have implications for other countries. Perhaps the context was different. But arguably it was one of the most important, not just democratizing, but strengthening aspect of what happened in US politics and governance in the 20th century. And something that gets very little acknowledgement, often including when we engage in with foreign partners about how it is that we went about our police reform and what enabled several phases of our police reform starting with the 60s. From a very corrupt police force to a police force that today is, by so many measures, so much better, accountable, less corrupt, more effective, more in contact with communities, and better serving the state than not only previously in the US, but in many countries of the world. And of course, British police force, another sort of classic model of designing police forces.
So I have Virginia on my phone here. We're going to try this. Virginia, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Okay. Now I'm just going to hold it up to the microphone. We'll see if this works. Virginia, you left us at using Afghanistan as a case study, I believe. Do you want to speak about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just really wanted to make a point about the consistency of approaches. If you compare Afghanistan to Latin America, well, we know that while Latin American countries such as Colombia and Mexico have been pressured by the US and others into intensive and intrusive measures to enforce international drug prohibition, which is strongly driven by law enforcement initiatives funded by foreign donors, the very large drug market in Afghanistan has been all but tolerated by international forces in favor of other priorities. And we can even take this a step further and say that counter-narcotics represented little more than an afterthought of military intervention, which is partly due to the fact that counter-narcotics policy and counterinsurgency are very difficult to reconcile. Specifically, if we have to target poppy crops, i.e. destroying people's livelihoods, this would be very counterproductive if our ultimate goal is to win hearts and minds, which is at the core of counterinsurgency. The approach, or the US and ISAF approach to counter-narcotics has been criticized as being ineffective, including by Russia, a country that has a particularly strong stand on drugs, as already mentioned by my colleagues there, and that also advocates a law enforcement-driven approach over a public health one, something that reflected in Russia's assistance packages to drug-producing and transit countries. Russia has identified Afghan opium production as a threat to global peace, and it is in this context that it put in place the Rainbow 2 plan to focus on eradication, intelligence exchange, the sanctioning of landlords on whose territory poppies are grown, the training of Afghan police, and also the donation of thousands and thousands of weapons. However, one could argue that such initiatives are aimed at diverting attention from ineffective domestic strategies, as seen in the large budgetary allocation for Russia's Rainbow program in Afghanistan the epidemics currently facing Russia. Interestingly, more recently, a Rainbow 3 plan was set up by Russia, this time in Central America. And again, this is very much focused on law enforcement, and the plan includes special training for Central American police forces, greater judicial cooperation to tackle narcotics and other forms of illicit trafficking. In the interest of time, there are more examples that I could use here, but people could ask me about them, including West Africa, which I think is a very interesting case study, because it's the latest region to have witnessed high levels of drug trafficking and now also a growing user population, but where old-fashioned law enforcement-driven approaches that have proved counterproductive elsewhere still prevail. But I don't want you to think that the whole project was just about criticizing existing practices. We do realize that introducing harm reduction and supply reduction practices into the design of aid packages poses a series of challenges, including the fact that harm reduction and prevention, intended in a broader sense, by which I mean including institutional building, social programs, and public health measures, are all long-term strategies. And in spite of the fact that in the longer term they are likely to be more cost-effective and also more sustainable, they also go against the desire for quick implementation and more easily quantifiable impact, such as arrests and seizures, which are more politically attractive. And this goes back to metrics mentioned by Dave earlier. But this is not all. I mean, there is a whole array of political dilemmas facing donors. I mean, the investment in foreign aid for fighting drug markets and reducing violence in other countries is at times a difficult measure to explain to citizens and voters. And while the fear of drugs and violence spilling over into donor countries remain a strong rationale for foreign aid, in the public eye, there's still a very fine line between investment in security and reckless spending. Moreover, foreign aid as a proxy for reducing the drug problem in donor countries also presents practical dilemma. Donors have to rely on recipients to invest the aid given to them in programs that are feasible, efficient, and effective, and also in the interest of donor countries. But doing so requires functioning recipient governments that have the ability to execute those programs and the control over functioning support structures such as law enforcement and judicial agencies, as well as shared interests between recipients and donors. Furthermore, other aspects of the link between donors and recipient countries may influence the aid relationship, such as neighborhood relations, economic ties, national security, or counterinsurgency interests, such as those I mentioned in the context of Afghanistan. And hence, issues related to supplying and demanding drugs that might not always be at the forefront of the relationship, and other considerations might take priority. So after all of this, how should we move forward? Well, in our report on this topic, we have a number of recommendations, but I'd like to finish with three key ones. The first is that donors should pay greater attention to what is needed by the recipient, i.e., should the supply reduction measures should be in tune with the local context. The second recommendation is that law enforcement should not be the key element of aid program, but instead it should come as part of a holistic package that also takes care of public health, social policy, justice, and also human rights aspects. And thirdly, I think there should be a clear distinction between short and long-term goals, i.e., restoring security in the short term and implementing drug-dependent treatment and alternative livelihood programs, to mention two examples, as part of the longer-term strategy. And I think I'll leave it to this. Thanks.
Thank you, Virginia. I hope you're all able to hear that. Glad that we were able to get her in. It's past 2:30, but we haven't had, because of the technical difficulties, as much time for questions as we usually allow. So maybe we'll do one round of a few questions, one after the other, and then let the panelists answer them that way. So we have right up here.
Hi, Ben Brake, State Department. There's a discussion about the sort of eroding consensus with respect to the International Drug Control Framework, or dissensus. With respect to 2014 high-level CND review and the 2016 on gas, I was just curious to hear the panel's speculation as to what, if you think a new consensus is possible, or it will just be sort of more or less confirming the status quo and muddling through. Just curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Are there others that we want to take right here? Just over in the back.
Hi, David Borden with StopTheDrugWar.org and the Drug War Chronicle newsletter. We're discussing modernized law enforcement here, primarily as an alternative to prohibition, but as has come up, in the long run, potentially, we'll be discussing modernized law enforcement as an alternative to legalization. Most of the discussion today, though not all, has been with regard to conventional criminality, retail drug markets, and so forth. When we get into the discussion of the drug trade funding insurgencies, does this alter the equation or the balance? Just offhand, without looking at numbers, it seems like one very serious instance of a vigorous drug trade, meaning a vigorous military conflict, could overwhelm all other concerns in its magnitude.
Great. We'll do one more if there are any, and also back on the left-hand side.
Oh, I'm on the right-hand side.
My left. Stage left, I think.
No, just a quick question. I was just curious as to why, when you're talking about law enforcement, it seems as though you're only talking about the police, and there's no discussion about the role of the judiciary or the justice sector. And even on the question of how you combat corruption, my understanding is one way that the U.S. dealt effectively with corruption in its police forces is it had a more aggressive prosecution function. You don't build clean police forces on their own, like you said, Vanda. So I wondered if there was an intentional reason, a conceptual reason why that is not part of the discussion.
Why don't we take these in reverse order? So Virginia, Vanda, and Dave. So Virginia, I'm going to put you next to the microphone again.
Yes, I'm afraid I didn't really hear the question. Really sorry.
Sorry about that. Then we're going to go right to Vanda. Sorry, Virginia.
I just can't hear, sorry.
Okay, Eric, let me go backwards. You are absolutely right, and the only reason it's folly of the speaker and our mission. You're absolutely right. Police reform is often critically dependent, and law enforcement reform is critically dependent on the interaction of the judiciary. That sometimes this requires reform of the judiciary, not always, and correction system, of course, play a critical role. And yes, absolutely, in the U.S. case, it was Bobby Kennedy, Justice Department, FBI that were the critical whip in lining many of the local police departments. But it was not just that. I mean, there were other innovations as well that were internal to the police. The moment the police precinct captains discovered just how much political support they got out of community policing and how few resources some of these approaches took. They took to it like sponge to water, and some of it was academically driven, but also it was police departments themselves discovering and experimenting. But yes, absolutely, it often needs to be couched within broader rule of law reform. The point I was trying to drive is that in many countries it's not just about justice and corrections and police, but it is about fundamental redefinition of the social contract and fundamental reshaping of political constellations of power and access and the notion what the state is about. Is it the Westphalian state supposedly serving the people while maintaining its interests, Or is it the state that's essentially a mafia bazaar whose purpose is to capture power so that resources can be channeled to one's narrow clique? And if the larger political piece falls out, then one can be demanding from police reform and complaining, and it will be very limited. The question about drugs and terrorists or drugs and insurgents. Virginia talked in her presentation about Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is a moment when I think 30, 40 years of evidence finally reached policymakers, and policymakers realized that just like we cannot eradicate our way out of use, we will not eradicate our way out of insurgency. And in fact, that eradication policies can strengthen insurgencies in multiple ways. The silent song that eradication bankrupts insurgents has not panned out anywhere, including not in Colombia. And you can take me on debating Colombia in the break, but I am right. In other cases, it blatantly, visibly didn't work, and it strengthened insurgents. Now, it's a lesson that some countries have not learned. Virginia was suggesting how extremely unhealthy Russia is with the suspension of eradication, and how it very much would like that policy, even as it is very much concerned about the defeat of the Taliban. 2016, Angus, I think is one of the key fundamental questions as to whether what we end up with is merely codification of the existing wording, even as policies are increasingly going in different directions, or whether we will end up with some more progressive language. What the Latin American countries seem to be heading toward is asking for greater flexibility within the implementation of the laws. And that's partially from the the regime. And that's partially because of the realization that Russia and China are bound to block any more radical reform. But it's a very interesting question to me, how much to ask for or how little to ask for. And is a better outcome one that essentially just asserts the same language, and then people, especially Latin America, goes its own different way? Or is it better to ask for a more dramatic language that more visibly exposes the disagreement and perhaps end up with no language? And there are two ways for a regime to end. The regime can end with the bank. Guatemala legalizes not just marijuana like Uruguay, but Guatemala legalizes everything, including trade. It can end with the whimper. Simply that the enforcer, the police, the top dog enforcing the regime will stop paying attention and get distracted and do other things, or realize that its enforcement was misguided. And so there are different ways how the regime can end up. And in many ways, I think that allowing for far greater flexibility of policies and far greater specificity to policies would be a good outcome. But I say that with the hedge that it is a domain that's filled with spillovers and externalities. And so there will always be grinding in the system, there will always be pushback, and that's even if the whole trade is legal. There will be balloon effects and there will be spillovers that will have negative externalities for some actors who will demand a different regime.
Okay. Again, reverse order. In response to Eric's question, in terms of organising the initial phase of the project, what inspired our focus? Practicality. Simply, it was just a more doable project with the definitions restricted largely to law enforcement services, police departments, policing, and of course we went beyond that within some of the reports. And in some of the reports we of course acknowledge that it's greater than that, and there's institutional linkages that are far broader. However, I think again, coming back to the earlier question, phase 2, phase 3, then clearly there's space to and opportunities hopefully to expand beyond that. With regard to David's question, I don't think I can add a great deal to what Vanda said. And with regard to Ben and the international system, just to go back and link to Vanda's opening comments about the state of the illicit market being at a very, let's say, interesting place at the moment. So is the international debate, the international system itself. We're entering uncharted water here. With my IR hat on, we've seen what we can call soft defection from the prohibitive core of the regime develop over many years, be engagement with harm reduction practices, decriminalisation of cannabis and other drugs for personal possession. Now, these are policy options that countries can pursue quite legitimately within the current restrictions, limitations, boundaries of the international treaty system. Now, we're clearly, in some countries, pushing up against the boundaries here. And it is not without a certain amount of irony and paradox that what we might want to call the cradle of prohibition has actually blown the whole system wide open with what's going on in Washington and Colorado. Because from my position, however you frame that, that puts the US in breach of the 1961 Civil Convention on Narcotic Drugs. The US government will come up with very intricate and perhaps quite convincing within some circles legal arguments about the federal government still being in adherence to the treaties. It's just the states doing it, therefore it's not one of our problems. But the US is not only therefore in a very awkward position, it is a really awkward position in regard to federal law and state law, but also the US government's relationship with the international treaty regime and its obligations that are related to being a party to the convention system. But what that has done is it's changed, I think, the policy landscape at the international system. As Vanda mentioned, since the birth of the international system, the US really has been the enforcer. It instigated the system. We can trace this all the way back to 1909. The modern era, 61 Convention, is very much a product of US endeavour. And it's been a rather unique international issue area, in as much as throughout the history of American foreign policy, post-war foreign policy, where there's been various engagement and disengagement with the UN system, the drug control treaties have always been a key area of interest. So for the US now to lose some of that, let's say, the moral standing, the higher ground, in terms of trying to encourage, let's say, other nation states to follow the punitive paradigm, that is very significant. So then that plays into the issue that that Vanda mentioned in terms of what is going to happen with countries now who want to move beyond the flexibility of the existing regime and how that plays out with countries who are still very much supporters of the status quo. So we heard about China, Russia Federation. I would argue that while the US is maybe stepping back as an enforcer, or at least not being as obstructionist at the international level, we're seeing an environment whereby the Russian Federation is shifting in and filling that gap. So it's a very, very interesting point in time in terms of the history of the regime. Now, my last point on this, because I'm just getting up ahead of steam, I have to stop myself. Vanda said, how do regimes end? It can be a bang or a whimper. I don't think with this regime it will be a whimper, because there are still parties who are keen to sustain the regime in its current form. So really it's going to be an issue of costs and benefits between states, how much political capital they want to invest in trying to change the international system, what costs supporters of the international system will be willing to bear in order to save the system in its current form, or as much of it as they can in its current form, and allowing that flexibility to increase. And I think that's the key now, is as we learn more about what we don't know about, we need to create space to allow countries to experiment with policies which then can be monitored, and we can learn what works and what doesn't work, getting back to my earlier point. So 2014, 2016, interesting time. I think it was the physicist Niels Bohr who said prediction is very difficult, particularly about the future. So we're aware of that. And I said it was going to be my last point. My last point, I promise, is I think it's quite significant, the IISS reports that came out earlier in the year. It's the first time you're getting a multilateral institution seriously considering an alternative to the current regime, and I think particularly within that some of the scenarios are quite important. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We'll end it here. Thank you for muddling through with us as we try to get Virginia in from San Francisco. Thank you to our panelists and to Virginia for also muddling through with us from San Francisco. Remember that Virginia's book is available, Drugs, Insecurity, and Failed States, available at the front desk. So I hope you all buy that. And hope to see you all again soon. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Virginia, thank you.